Hello, guys. This is our third class, which is democracy and trade preferences. And we're going to cover the basic following ideas. Trade has distributional consequences, and trade policy is shaped by governments' responses to the demands of different interest groups. Government responses to interest groups are shaped by political institutions. And we are going to explain why this chapter develops an analytical tool central to a society-centered approach. And we are going to focus first on interest group preferences, which groups prefer protectionism, and which groups prefers liberalization. In order to do that, we're going to develop two models, the factor model and the sector model. This class is linked to the previous one, in which we cover different types of trade economic models. But the main idea of this chapter is try to understand why protectionism is a strategy for countries. We covered in the previous lecture this concept of comparative advantages and why there is comparative advantages and why comparative advantages could explain why the countries engage in trade and so on and so forth. However, we are not explaining why, even when there are some very good conclusions about the benefits that free trade could create to countries, countries could remain outside of the international trade. So in order to do that, we're going to talk about trade policy preferences. The first model is the factor model. So the factor model argues that trade politics are driven by competition between factors of production. So by competition, we are arguing competition between labor and capital, and competition between workers and capitalists. Recall from the last class, countries have comparative advantages in producing goods requiring their abundant factor. So there are two types of countries, capital abundant countries and labor abundant countries. We understood that capital abundant countries should specialize in the production of goods that requires more capital. That reduces the cost of producing this type of goods, and because of that, they should specialize in the production of these products because they have comparative advantages in doing so. The same story is for the labor abundant countries. In labor abundant countries, the price of labor is cheaper comparative to capital abundant countries. And because of that, they should specialize in the products that require more labor than capital. And based on that, the specialization patterns divide the production around the globe, depending on the opportunity cost and the cost of production using the production factors. So, however, why is there a clash between capital and labor? And this is a very important and very key question because it's very related to the idea of protectionism. So assume the following scenario. We have only two countries, the US and China. We have only two sectors, agriculture and manufacture, and the US is abundant in capital and China is abundant in labor. However, something that we cover in the previous class, but we are going to get deep into this topic, is the intensity. So agriculture is a sector that is labor intensive. That doesn't mean that agriculture doesn't need capital to produce. Of course, it needs capital. In fact, land is a type of capital. However, to produce agriculture, Well, the agricultural goods need more labor, need more farmers, need more human workers to produce. However, manufacture is capital intensive. Of course, to produce manufacturers, we need labor. However, we need more intermediary goods and technology to produce these types of goods. So we need more capital. So we are going to link the factor production intensive to the abundant factor production of the country to explain better the ideas of specialization and the possible strategy of protectionism. So these assumptions establish who produce what. Capital will be relatively cheap and labor will be relatively expensive in the United States. Why? Because United States is capital abundant. So given that capital is abundant and labor is scarce, well, the price is lower in capital and expensive in labor. Whereas the opposite will be in China. In China, given that it's a labor intensive, labor abundant, well, the price of labor relatively to the United States is cheaper, and the price of capital is expensive. Consequently, the United States will export the capital intensive good, manufacture, and will import the labor intensive good, agriculture. Whereas in China, China will export the labor-intensive good and import the capital-intensive good. Why? Well, because given that the prices will determine the cost, that will give or define the opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost generates the specialization patterns, and United States will produce more and specialize in the production of manufacturers, and of course, they will produce more than the national demand to export these types of goods to the international market. In that process, they will import the goods that they are sacrificed in order to produce more manufacture. In this case, it's agriculture. The same is in China. We can see that in the factor model in autarky. So we are defining the PPF and the indifferent curves in each country. So in the y-axis, as I am presenting in the slide, sorry, there are manufacturing goods. In the x-axis, we have the agricultural goods. So we are depicting the equilibrium in autarky, and both countries have to produce both goods because this is a closed economy. However, one thing that I want to highlight in this moment is how the PPF are different in each country. As you can see, the PPF in the US is biased towards the manufacturing goods. And in China, the PPF is biased towards the agricultural goods. What does that mean? That means that China produces more agricultural goods. If they decide to use all their production factors to produce only agriculture, the level of agriculture is higher than in the US if they decided to produce only agricultural goods. The same as in manufacture. So in manufacture, notice that this is better here, because we can compare both graphs. If the US decide to produce only manufacturers and they allocate all their production factors to produce manufacturers, they could achieve higher levels of production than in China. That's why we are saying that the PPFs are biased. The US is capital abundant. So the PPF is biased towards manufacture. Why? Because manufacture is capital intensive. They require more capital to produce, and given that they have more capital, they could achieve higher levels of production. The same as in China. China is labor abundant. Agriculture as a sector is labor intensive. So if they want to produce only agriculture, they could achieve higher levels of agriculture. So what happens if they open their economy? We're going to modify a little bit the Ricardian model to notice what happens with the production factors. So the United States will export the capital-intensive good, which is manufacture. They have more capital, so they could produce more. So in Turkey, the price of manufacture is relatively cheaper. As well, that the price of agriculture is relatively expensive in comparison to China. Americans will export agricultural goods at lower prices. If an American have on the table, I don't know, I'm going to assume that both countries produce rice. Or not, yes, rice. So the rice produced in America should be expensive than in China because rice needs more labor, and labor in America is expensive than in China. So because of that, the final price, the retail price of rice in America, produced an American rice, is higher. So an American consumer prefer the Chinese rice because it's cheaper. This means that agricultural firms will close in America and more manufacturing firms will appear and produce. Why? Because if we are opening our economy, if we are opening the American economy, and we are tending to specialize in the production of manufacture because we have a cheaper capital here, well, and the consumers will not buy American agricultural products because they are very expensive. Well, those firms that could not compete with the prices of more competitive countries, such as in this case, China, well, those firms should close their production. And what is going to happen is that they will that movement or that consequence will move the assignation of factors of production. So the firms that are within the agricultural sector and they are not competitive and they are closing their production because they cannot compete with the lower prices of China, they are going to close. So they are going to fire workers and they are going to sell the capital that they are using. Given that we need to produce more manufactured goods because we are specializing in this type of products, these firms need to demand more labor and more capital. And they are going to get these production factors from the firms that are closing. So at the end, the production factors that are not being used in these firms are going to be demanded by the new firms that will appear in the manufacturing sector. So the economy as a whole is going to be in a different scenario. We're going to move from the autarky situation to the free trade situation. But the free trade situation is going to divide the demand to the supply. And remember, in free trade, demand is not equal to supply. So first, we are going to move the supply in the free trade. So we are going right now, moving our production to this scenario in which we reduce the agricultural production and we increase the manufacturer production. This, of course, will change the prices, the final prices. Why? Because this price, the price of agriculture in the free trade, are going to be lower in comparison to the autarky scenario. Remember, right now, American citizens are buying agricultural goods from China, and China produces agricultural goods with lower prices. So that's why we are going to move to the supply or the production in the economy here. But what happens with the demand? So the demand right now is facing an income positive effect. With the reduction of prices in agricultural goods, Americans will buy more goods. Therefore, in free trade, American consumers will buy agricultural goods at cheaper price, the Chinese price. Due to their income could buy more goods, because right now they could buy agricultural goods at lower prices, their utility will increase. So we are now here in the demand. So this is the autarky position. This is the autarky position, and this is the demand position. So we achieve a higher level of utility, which is the conclusion of the Ricardian model. However, who gains in this process? Who gains in this trade? Capital. Firms located in manufacturing sectors receive higher rewards. Why? Well, two reasons. The firms that could continue producing, well, they could expand their production. And second, they will appear more firms. Why? Because with this new situation in which the American economy is specializing in the manufacturing production, well, there will create incentive to create new firms. And with new firms, there will be more competition within that sector, and the sector will be more competitive. So manufacturers and the owners of capital will gain. But who loses? And this is a good question that we touched a little bit in the previous class, but we are going to explain more. In America, the sector that loses is not agriculture itself, is labor. Why? Because given that agriculture is labor intensive, well, there will be more unemployment. And because of that, who loses in the international trade is the workers. What happens in China? Well, this is the autarky scenario and the supply movement after the free trade. China will export the labor-intensive good, which is agriculture. In autarky, the price of manufacturers is relatively expensive, and the price of agriculture is relatively cheaper in comparison to America. Chinese, of course, will import manufactured goods at lower prices. Why at lower prices? Well, because they are going to take advantage of the lower cost of production of manufacturers in America. So they will get manufactured goods at American prices, and American prices are lower than Chinese prices in this example. So this means that manufacturer firms will close. Why? Because these firms are not competitive. These firms are not competitive. And more agricultural firms will appear to produce more. So this will move the assignation of factor of production. So we are going to move from autarky to supply in free trade. Remember, demand is not equal to supply in free trade. So China will produce more agriculture and they will reduce their production of manufacturers. But what happens with the demand? So with the reduction of prices in manufactured goods, Chinese will buy more goods. Therefore, in free trade, Chinese consumer will buy more manufactured goods at cheaper prices, the American price. So they could demand more manufactured goods because they are allowed to buy these products to America, and America is producing these products at lower prices. So due to their income could buy more goods, their utility increases. So we are moving from autarky point to demand point. Who gains in this scenario? Workers, labor. Why? Well, because given that agriculture is the export sector, well, agriculture is going to demand more workers. Agriculture is labor intensive, so they require more labor to produce. So labor is going to increase their utility. However, the owners of capital will lose in this scenario. Why? Well, because their production, the Chinese production of manufactured goods, is reduced. So these firms that are not competitive has to shut down their facilities, has to fire their labor, but especially has to sell their capital. So in the factor model, trade causes that the income of the abundant factor to rise. So the income of the sector that requires more abundant factor will be better off. However, the income of the scarce factor is going to fall. So trade will reduce the benefits of the non-competitive sectors. And in this case, is the scarce factor. And this is a very important conclusion, that abundant factors win from globalization, which means that the scarce factors lose from globalization. Remember, in the US, owners of capital could export their goods and there expand their production. According to this model, they could absorb the factors of production of the non-competitive sectors, and they sell and produce more. They win. These are the reasons because of they win. In the US, on the contrary, labor is negatively affected by trade. Agricultural firms have to shut down, and their production is replaced by Chinese firms. What happens with the prices? So here, the prices are being explained by the supply and demand force. In autarky, in the US, labor is expensive and capital is cheaper. In China, labor is cheaper and capital is expensive. Why? Because US is capital abundant and China is labor abundant. However, in free trade, the US will export manufactured goods. Given that they will export manufactured goods, they require more capital and less labor. So increments in the demand of capital raises the price of capital. Why? Because remember this, they are require more capital. So capital is going to be in demanding. And when some product in the market is in demanding, its price should be higher. That's why the owners of capital will gain in this scenario. On the other hand, reduction in the demand of labor reduces the price of labor. No one wants to hire human capital. I mean, of course, manufacturing sectors requires human capital, but not in the same amount as agricultural sector. So the price of the labor, which is the wage, will be lower in this scenario. And that's why workers will be worse off in America. In China, given that China exports agricultural goods, they require less capital and more labor. So increments in the demand of labor will raise the price of labor. So Chinese workers will expect higher wages. And in the same process, there will be a reduction in the demand of capital that will reduce the price of capital. So who loses in China are the owners of capital. And based on that, there is something that is called factor price equalization. Factor price equalization says that in free trade equilibrium, the price of capital in the US tends to rise up to the price of capital in China. And the price of labor in the US tends to reduce up to the price of labor in China. There is a tendency for trade to cause factor price to converge. The scarce factors receive lower income after the international trade. This is established by one of the most famous economists in international field, which is Paul Samuelson. He won the Nobel Prize. And this is the factor price equalization analysis. So we are in autarky in both countries. So wages in the US are higher than in China because workers and labor is scarce in comparison to China. But the price of capital, which is the rent, is lower in the US than in China. Why? Because in China, capital is scarce, and in the US, it's abundant. However, in free trade, given that the US needs more capital, well, the price of the capital has to increase comparatively. So tends to equalize the same level as in China. And wages in China that are very low are going to increase to equalize the levels of wages in the US. Of course, they will be in, not in the middle, but tends to be in the middle, the final price. The prices tends to rise the rent rise to the level of rent in China, and the wages in China tends to rise at the levels of the US. So wages for American workers will fall and wages for Chinese workers will rise until wages in two countries are the same. The return or the rent to Chinese capital will fall and the return or rent to American capital will rise until the return to capital in two countries is the same. Of course, as you could read in the book, there are some limitations of this factor price equalization. If the world is completely open, we should expect the same prices of the production factors in every single country. However, we know that this is not true. We know that the levels of wages in the US are higher than, I don't know, Uganda, right? And the reason that is behind that is because we need that, we saw that there are some barriers and costs associated in the international market that prevents that the factor price equalization works. So because of protectionism and because of there are some barriers that the trade that prevents that the trade could be very open, that limited the convergency patterns. However, this idea of factor price equalization is the base of one of the most important theorems in international political economy and in trade economics, which is the Stopper-Samuelson theorem. Remember, Samuelson was the scholar who created this type of models and who won the Nobel Prize because of that. The Stopper-Samuelson theorem is an economic theory that explores the relationship between international trade, factor price, and income distribution. The theorem is based on the assumption of perfect competition, factor mobility within a country, and two factors of production, labor and capital. The theorem states that if a country is relatively abundant in a particular factor of production, I don't know, for instance, labor, the factor's real wage rate will increase, while the return to the relatively scarce factor, for instance, capital, will decrease. So we are the factor, the Stopper-Samuelson theorem establishes this relationship. So in a way, we are expecting that if there is a free trade, countries with capital abundant will export the products that are requiring more capital, and the owners of capital will gain. Why? Because their price will tend to rise. In the labor abundant countries, they will export the products that comes from labor intensive sectors. And the labor, which is the abundant factor, will expect higher levels of income and better off situations. This is the Stopper-Samuelson theorem. However, the Stopper-Samuelson theorem, this is a way to read the Stopper-Samuelson theory, but the other way to read the Stopper-Samuelson theory is that there are losers. And this is the first time when we talk about the losers, because in the previous class, we only talk about the benefits of the trade. However, there are losers within free trade. In the US, labor will get lower prices, so they will get lower income, so they will be worse off. And in China, the owners of capital will get lower prices, will get lower income, and they will be worse off. But remember that one of the most important assumptions that support this theorem is the factor mobility. What is factor mobility? We already saw what is factor mobility, but we are again explaining factor mobility. We're expecting that, for instance, these firms that are shutting down their production because they are not competitive, well, they are releasing their production factors, such as labor and capital. But given that these types of models are assuming that the country should not have unemployment or unutilized capital, I mean, we cannot have capital without being used in the sectors. Well, the capital and labor that are releasing from the non-competitive firms, they will be employed in these new firms or in the expansion of the previous firms that are producing agricultural products in this example in China. So there is a factor mobility. So if there is a worker that is fired in the manufacturing sector in China, that person will be immediately hired in the agricultural sector in China. However, this is a very good question. Are factors of production mobile between sectors? And what I'm referring here is, could a worker from agricultural sector be employed to produce manufacturers? What do you think? Let me put that question in another words. Could a farmer be employed in a firm that produces computers? Could a farmer, I don't know, in Ohio be employed in Facebook, in Twitter, in some high-tech firm in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco? What do you think? If you want to pause the video and write down some possible answers, and let's discuss these answers in next minutes. So, okay. The answer is no, of course not. Of course not. Why? Well, because the skills and the human capital is different. The requirements of human capital are very different from one sector to another sector. And there is very difficult to adapt their skills to produce agricultural goods, to produce manufactured goods. So a person who is very skilled to farm, to, I don't know, to grow plants and so on and so forth, these goods are very difficult to be adapted and transferred to produce computers or to coding programs and so on and so forth. And the other way around, if you are working in a high-tech company and you are very good coding, those types of skills are very difficult to be translated to produce bananas, right? So this is why we need another model that could solve this type of assumptions, because even when the Stopper-Samuelson is a very good theorem to understand what is happening in the international field, well, these have some limitations. Why? Because they are assuming that the factor mobility is perfect. So they are assuming that if a person is hired in this sector and this sector is shutting down, well, they could be suddenly hired in the other sector. But in reality, that doesn't happen. And that's why we need the sector model. The sector model argues that trade politics are driven by competition between industries. There is a fact that you have to highlight in this moment. Sector model argues that trade divides society across industry because the assumption it makes about factor mobility. Factor mobility refers to the ease with which labor and capital can move from one industry to another. And remember, the factor model, which is not the sector model, the factor model was the model that we just already seen. So assumes that factors are highly mobile. Labor and capital can move easily from one industry to another. But the sector models recognize that this is not true. And this is highly untrue. That's why the sector model does not assume that. Of course, if there are some, of course, there are some skills that you can transfer from one job to another job, and you will do that in your career, right? However, it's very difficult to move all your skills to another type of sector because that sector will require different type of human capital. So based on that, factors are tied or specific to the sector in which they are currently employed. So capital currently employed in manufacture production cannot easily move to the agricultural industry. Same as workers also often have industry-specific skills that do not transfer easily from one sector to another. So when factors are immobile, trade affects the incomes of all factors employed by a given industry in the same way. What does that mean? We saw in the Hershey-Olin and Ricardian model, and even in the factor model, that there are losers, right? The losers are the non-competitive sectors. But not but the losers are not, are only one of the factors of production. So if the factor of production is the scarce factor, well, that would be the loser. So, for instance, in America, they are these countries capital abundant. So workers are going to be the losers, according to Ricardian model, Hershey-Olin model, and the factor model. However, the sector model will say, well, not only the workers, but also the owners of capital in the non-competitive sectors. Why? Because those owners of capital could not move the capital to the abundant intensive sector. Why? Because there are different needs and specifications of capital that are required to the competitive sectors. So let's explain that better. So imagine that this is an industrialized countries. So capital is abundant. So after the economy is open, capital-intensive sectors will be the winners and labor-intensive sectors will be the losers. But, and this is a huge but, if factors of production are specific, capital and labor employed in capital incentive sectors won't gain from trade. So what does that mean? That the human capital employed in the capital intensive sectors, so those guys that are that have the specific skills to produce manufactures, they will get higher wages. They will get better worker conditions. And the owners of capital in these sectors will get higher prices and higher and better conditions. However, not only the labor employed in the labor-intensive sectors will lose, but also the owners of capital. I don't know, imagine that, what do you say that in English? Yes, I don't know. The capital that you need to grow plants. The physical capital that you need to produce avocado, to produce bananas. This type of capital is not be demand by high-tech companies. They do not require that capital, but the owners of this type of capital will lose also from trade. In other words, capital and labor employed in export-oriented sector, which are the capital incentive sectors, will gain, and capital and labor employed in import competing sectors will lose. In developing countries, the story is kind of the same. The developing countries are labor abundant. After their economies open, capital-intensive sectors will be the losers, and labor-intensive sectors will be the winners. But if factors of production are specific, the capital and labor employed in capital-intensive sectors will lose from trade. Computers, machinery, so on and so forth, those types of capital that are required to produce manufacturers, they are not, will be required and demand by firms. Engineers, computer engineers, I don't know, economists, I don't know. I have a friend that holds a PhD in robotics. Robotics. That guy will be in the worst scenario in developing country. Why? Because he will not be employed in to produce avocados. So capital and labor employed in labor-intensive sectors both gain from trade. And again, capital and labor employed in exporter-oriented, which are the labor-intensive sectors, will gain, and capital and labor employed in importing competing sectors, which are the capital incentive sectors, will lose. And what do we do about losers? This is a political question. We could protect them using tariffs, barriers, subsidize. We will cover that later on. However, the problem with this type of sectors is that we are preventing to our country to receive the benefits of free trade. So protection is a possibility, but carries on cost of doing that. We can compensate them. We can give more training or a retirement package. That could be a possibility. The problem with more training is that even when more training could be possible, well, it is very, very, very difficult to move and to provide the skills and to adapt the skills. So of course we can move people from one sector to another sector. However, these bridges needs too much time to do that. We can repress them, no? In dictatorships, they use repression. No? Venezuela, for instance, they equalize the wages for everyone. They didn't care about your skills, but that could create higher costs than benefits. Or we can use democracy and voting for more protection, right? And if you have been very interested in politics, you should know that in the last 20 years, the world has been more conservative. than before. That's why we have experienced some conservative presidents such as Trump or other guys around the world. Even we have experienced globalization backlash because of the sentiment of losing due to the globalization. Please see these two videos about globalization backlash. They are very interesting, and they could explain better than in the book what is the meaning about these ideas about losers. The first one will explain you a little bit more the relationship between inequality and globalization, and how the inequality and the reduction of the middle class income in the developed countries are one of the most important arguments against globalization. And the other one gives you a very wide opening perspective about how the world has changed in the last 2 decades, and how there has been a very wrong and bad feeling related to globalization. So what do we do about losers? So as you can see in the videos, the answer depends on 3 things: the size of the people who lose, their political resources, and the political institutions. Why the size? Well, because there is the logic of collective action. So large size means more free riding. Small size means that the benefits are concentrated. Keep in mind one thing: if you want to fight for your rights, that implies a cost. You have to fight, you have to stand up, you have to mobilize, you have to create networking, talk to another guys, try to create better way to protect yourself. So the larger the group, the lower incentive to fight. Why? Because you believe that others will fight and you prefer not to do it. This is the free riding problem. And there are coordination problems. Yes, let's go to fight. Yeah, but we have to fight together. We have to mobilize together. We have to march, so on and so forth. So the more people free riding, the lower likelihood to change the situation. And that's what happens with the workers at the end around the globe. Given that workers are bigger, the size of the workers are bigger than the owners of capital, well, there is a collective action. There is a collective action problem with the workers, and that's why workers are not being have not been able to fight for their rights. And of course, this is very intertwined with the political power. Why? Because workers, the size is big, but the political power is small. Capitalists, on contrary, their size is small, so they could coordinate better, but the political power are big, so they could create higher, they could create more lobby in the government, they could buy politicians, the political campaigns, and so on and so forth. So the action at the end, if the group is winner, I mean, the group is the workers or the capitalists. Well, if the capitalists are winner, they are the winner, well, they will create an action for free trade. But if they are in a world or in a country which the labor is abundant, well, they will demand more protection. That's why producers and not consumers dominate trade politics. This is why either free trade or protection, depending on the collective action, which is lobby, made by the capitalist. Depending on the type of democracy, majoritarian or proportional representation, the groups with more political power could influence the policies to favor the preferred action. And in fact, as you could read in the book, governments in countries with proportional representation systems to maintain, they try to maintain lower tariffs and other types of trade barriers. Why? Because governments in those countries are more inclined to mobilize the demands of small groups than the majoritarian or the bigger groups, such as in the majoritarian electoral systems. The small groups that benefit from protection can more easily influence policy in majoritarian than in proportional systems. So this is the end of the class number 3. And this is the end of the first week. Again, I hope that you could understand a little bit more the concepts that are explained in the book. If you have any questions or suggestions, don't hesitate to send me an email, and that's it. So see you in the next class. Bye.